Thank you, Althea. Hopefully, this sounds like this is working all right. Everybody can hear me? Good. Okay. I see so many familiar faces in the crowd here, although I guess I do know a number of people in Fairbanks. If people are wondering, that the title of this, As Green as It Gets, is a little bit nebulous. It's a program on art and how we mix paint to get the best greens. So not really, no. So I do want to talk about energy efficiency and sustainability. Living in Fairbanks, Alaska, we do have some challenges. I'll get into that a little bit more as we go on. If folks have a real pressing question, go ahead and get my attention and ask as we go along. I will stick around at the end for any questions that you want to ask until the security throws us out of here. There's so many things to talk about in sustainable construction and energy efficiency, renewable energy, architectural design, all the things that I worked on in putting into my house. And I'll be talking mostly about my house, but I really don't want to focus on my house. I want to focus on the concepts, the ideas, and kind of stay at 60,000 feet conceptually on these items and use my house as an example of a way to do things. And I'll point out some things that may not be the best way and some things that I do think are good. I learned a lot in this process, and so I'd like to share some of that with you as we go along. And so my house has been known as a number of different names. When I first built it, there was an article in the News Miner, and people got the substance of the article, but they didn't really know what to call it, so they called it That House. And I became that guy with that house. And actually, I thought that was kind of cool. I liked being that guy with that house. And when I'm dead and gone, I'd rather be known as that guy with that house than the mayor, to tell you the truth. My house was also dubbed As Green as It Gets, and that's kind of where the title from where this came from. However, no, it's not as green as it gets. It's a good start. It's a major step in the right direction, and we did a lot of things right. But when you enter into a construction project or you're working on your house, there's somewhere between 5 and 20 million different decisions you get to make. And the point, that one of the major points in this discussion is to have the right attitude as you make those decisions and consider efficiency every time you make one of those decisions, from floor covering, wall surfaces. I mean, there's just so many things in a design. So you want to focus on that end of things, and there is no one way to do it. I mean, there are some basic concepts. We all got dressed to come here today. There's nobody that's naked. But we all solved the solution of clothing differently. We solved it the way we're comfortable and what we like to wear. This beats a tie. It beats the heck out of wearing a tie. And so I dressed casual this evening. And same with homes. You want it to meet your needs, your site, and we'll talk about that some more. So is this as green as it gets? No. There's lots of options in different colors and different ways to do things. And we can talk about that more. Whoops, wrong arrow. So briefly, I love to canoe, if I didn't mention that. I am from Rochester, New York originally, and I'm a PE teacher by education, and I did a little bit of that in Rochester, and then I came and worked at the university, and I was the manager of the pub, the very first manager of the pub at the university, and worked in student activities, and I also taught canoeing, which I really enjoyed. Did I mention that? I then was a general contractor for a number of years and designed a variety of homes here in Fairbanks and developed an appreciation for our climate and the severity of our climate. And then I worked as the Arctic Winter Games Executive Director in '88, where I met people from the Borough who said I should ask to become the park superintendent in between canoe trips. This is a different trip. Anyway, then I was promoted to Parks and Rec Director, and then I retired. And as you can see, I didn't do retirement well, so I came out of retirement and I was a general manager for Arctic Sun Renewable Energy Company. And I worked with different kinds of renewable energy, all different kinds of renewable energy, and I helped design some energy efficient homes and worked with RENA Construction Company as part of my job with manager at Arctic Sun. And I was also elected to the assembly while I was doing that, and after a few years, I retired again. And I didn't do retirement well, so then I ran for borough mayor, and I'm not retired anymore. So I stay busy. So why are we talking about this energy efficiency stuff? You know, I was feeling guilty for a number of years living here in Fairbanks, Alaska with 14,000 heating degree days. It does get cool in Fairbanks, you may have noticed, on occasion, and we get lots of that. And so the energy demands for living here and our environmental footprint existing in Fairbanks is pretty significant. And I was starting to think, is it really responsible with some of the homes that we have living here in Fairbanks? So the amount of energy that we go through and our contributions to climate change. Back when I first started thinking about this, climate change wasn't a big topic. But I was still concerned about all of this, as well as the cost of it. You know, you can live in a tent if you have a big boiler that runs constantly and you can stay warm. Probably not comfortable, which is something we'll talk about later also. But it's just, we can do better. We can do better, we need to do better, and it's really important in the environment in which we live here in Fairbanks. So for me, this started back in the 1970s when I went from Fairbanks down to Southern California. I was best man in a friend's wedding down there. And I was sitting in a convertible out in the sunshine waiting to get gasoline, because back then there was gas rationing in California, and you could only get gas on even numbered days if you had an even numbered license plate. And if you had an odd numbered license plate, you got gas on odd days. And this created very long lines for gasoline, and it was very inconvenient. And I was thinking as I was toasting in this convertible and frowning a little bit like this guy is, saying there's got to be a better way, you know. And I started thinking about our whole system and our dependency on oil and fossil fuels in general, and how we lived and how we used energy. And I said, you know, at some point in time in my life, I'm going to see if I can do better than the current model. And I started thinking about it. That was in the 1970s. I'm a slow learner. It took me 40-some years to get where I was going. But, you know, I got there, and I built this home that I affectionately call Sunset Roost out on Old Murphy Dome Road. It's an octagon-shaped, has a wind turbine. It has solar electric panels, and it has solar thermal panels on it. It has all sorts of really cool technology. I decided to blend as much as I could, including a masonry heater, and connect all these systems, because once you start doing this, you can add efficiency to other systems. If you're already working with solar thermal, you can put a hydronic loop in your masonry heater because you've already got all the rest of the plumbing in place, so you can pull some heat off your masonry heater and stick it into your domestic hot water system very cheaply. So once you start down this trail, adding components and the synergy created by doing that can be interesting, and I wanted to see how far we could go with that. And that was my dream. I said, how green can I build? And I was mostly looking at the technology at the time. I'm kind of a technology-oriented guy. I like science, you know, I like the numbers, and solar panels are really cool, you know. So I was focusing more on that, but in order to make that stuff work and be efficient, I needed to have an efficient structure, and I knew lowering the load, so your house is a balance of the load, the demand, and the energy that you're putting in. You got to balance those things. If I lower the load, obviously I don't need as much energy. And I started, as this project evolved, I started focusing more and more on the efficiency side of this equation. And it's one of the most important things I learned in this whole project is that's really the most important thing. The technology's fun. But if you lower your demand to 1/10, less than 1/10 of where you started, you almost don't care where your energy comes from, because you don't need much of it. And in Fairbanks, Alaska, with 14,000 heating degree days, you can lower your energy demands to a very, very low level. And I'll give you some more numbers as we go on. And so I was dreaming about putting all this together. And this is the view out of my living room window. That's Denali and 4-acre, which is why we call it Sunset Roost. We get nice sunsets off to the southwest. So in working on this, I have a pet peeve that I came up with through this process. In our society, when we look at building a home, most of our homes are kind of rectangular, like the one at the top there. They might be a little bit more square, but typically we build rectangular homes, sometimes with lots of little pop-outs. I love those. They're so cool looking. However, there's a problem with efficiency when you do that. And so the model that we tend to use in our society is we have a social orientation to house design and placement and such. I call it my Better Homes and Garden philosophy for home design. You look through a bunch of floor plans in a magazine, Better Homes and Garden, whatever, and you find a floor plan that you really like, and so you go, okay, I'm going to build this house. Here's my dream house. I'm going to build this, and you buy a piece of property and you stick that house on that piece of property. Well, typically, homes are designed with a nice show front, big glass windows out to the street. That's the social orientation for a house. So you're almost guaranteed that that orientation, you got a 3/4, 75% chance, north, south, east, or west, that that orientation is wrong from an efficiency perspective. Because all your glass could be on the north side of your house, or the east side, or the west side. And you're more likely going to lose in that equation. Because really, you want solar gain and you want some energy coming in and some advantages having the glass on the south side of your house, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So the social orientation of facing your house to the street does not work from an energy perspective, unless the street happens to be on the south side of your house. You're lucky enough to have that. So when you start thinking about designing a house, if you think about efficiency, where you live and how the house is going to sit on it. I camped on my piece of property for a week so I could watch the sun move and so I could get a feel for the property and where the views were and all of that. So I was really part of that piece of land with the house design. That was very helpful in then designing the house. And every decision you make leads into whether the house ultimately is going to be as green as it gets or not. You know, how efficient it will be. I wasn't overly enamored with octagons, but I built an octagon. And as you look at these different shapes, you notice that the perimeter is significantly different on each of those shapes. What isn't different, they're all identical in size of square footage contained by the shape. So if you're reading the numbers and you live in a 2,000 square foot octagon house, the perimeter of your house is 160 feet. That would be 35 feet shorter than if you lived in a rectangle. That's about 18%. Well, how do you lose heat out of a house? Out of the perimeter. So just by building an octagon, same size house, the different shape is going to lose less heat because there's less wall space to lose heat out of. What drives me nuts are these new designs that I think they look cool. The architects that build the cantilever stickouts and you see all the, these different layers on houses. I totally agree the aesthetics are cool with those. However, from an efficiency perspective, they're off the charts. They're way worse than the plain rectangle. Not only are you having extra exterior wall space, you're creating more floor exposure also with every pop-out that you have with a second story. So do you really need those? I'm always jabbing architect friends of mine, like energy efficiency doesn't need to be ugly. Think of a nice, appealing design that's also efficient. And maybe you should start with some of the efficient concepts before you get into the aesthetics. Think about how can I make this shape more appealing aesthetically or whatever. So it's the mindset going into this whole project that really makes a success out of an energy efficient home. If you just make that a priority, not necessarily priority one, but a consideration, if you always start there with the decision, whether it's the kind of insulation you're using, the siding, the shape of the house, all these different numbers of windows, placement of windows, all of those things ultimately produce the efficiency of a home. So passive solar design is your first priority, and it is way, way the most important priority if you really want to be energy efficient, because it's the only free energy you get. Passive solar. So solar panels aren't free. If you bought any, yeah, they're getting cheaper, but they're not free. Installing them's not free. They do wear out over time. So you've got maintenance with those sorts of things. There's no maintenance with passive solar design. It's just the design of the house, basically, and proper window placement and such. And unless the neighbor throws a rock through your window, it's pretty maintenance free. So if you focus on that, and I'll give you some numbers in a little bit, it can make a huge difference in the efficiency of the home, even here in Fairbanks, Alaska. This is the phase you need to focus on with a house. You can't spend too much time on the design and walking through the design with somebody who has some background. And conceptually, you just keep thinking about efficiency as you go. You might notice the circle in the upper left corner says D3B. So I was sketching homes on graph paper and working on it, and I started with Plan A. Of course, you always start with Plan A. And then I had Plan A1 and A2 and A3. And then we noodled it down to Plan A2 was the best of those. But then we had A2, B, and C. And then we threw Plan A in the toilet and started with Plan B, 1 and 2. So you can imagine it took a while to get to D3B, which is what we built. That's my house. On the back of a napkin. And so to be successful with your design and successful with passive solar, you need to design for solar gain. That's getting the sunshine in your house, collecting that free energy that's out there. You need some sort of battery capacity, thermal mass, to store some of that. Thermal mass is nothing but a battery, and you're storing some solar energy with it and getting it back later. All of that's free, and an efficient envelope to make sure you're not losing heat to the environment any faster than you need to. So let's talk about these in reverse order. So an efficient envelope needs to be airtight, no thermal bridges, and you need good R value. This is my house under construction. It is a remote wall system is the design, what it's called. I would not recommend building this if I were you. There's an Arctic wall construction that I think is superior to this. The concept you need to take home is you need good R value. And you need it to be airtight and no thermal bridges. Thermal bridges are ways for air to leak through a wall or pieces of metal that might conduct through a wall. Any way you, and even studs, anywhere your insulation value is decreased at a specific point or a stud creates a bridge through the wall and you lose energy. So you want to minimize those, and you essentially can eliminate those with this design or with an Arctic wall design and have no thermal bridges. It's possible to do that, pretty close to no thermal bridges. And air tightness, everybody knows about that, and I won't get into vapor barriers. We talk about that later if you want. But high R value. My house is a 2x6 wall, high density fiberglass insulation in the 2x6 space, 3 layers of rigid foam that are each 3 inches thick with all the joints lapped so there's no crack all the way through the wall. And that's what you're looking at in that picture. Scissor truss roof with 24 inches cellulose minimum. That's at the ends of the wall. And a little deeper through the center part of that with 10 inches of foam underneath the slab. This is a slab on grade home. And we can get into details on all this stuff if you want later with questions, but we'll keep moving for now. Thermal mass is cheap and easy, and in my house, I accomplish most of the thermal mass with quite a few rocks. And Mr. Dan Givens over here is the man who set all of those rocks in my house. Both the bench that you see along the big window there and the planters, and you'll see the masonry heater in a minute. There's rocks in my master bathroom. There's a rock island in the kitchen. All that stuff is just thermal mass. It's heavy stuff, including the dirt and the planters, that soaks up heat when it's available and then gives it back. So what that does is it takes the spikes out of the temperature. People who heat with wood and a wood stove, you typically get a big blast of heat and the temperature in your house goes up, and then it cools off quite a bit and you get this kind of heating pattern in your house. The same with a lot of solar design homes. They had a tendency to overheat because there was nowhere to go with all the heat. You're getting all this sunlight coming in your windows and the house overheats because it's well insulated. So you need to do something with it, and the thermal mass will soak it up. So in addition to the planters and the benches and the masonry heater, literally tons of rock in my house, there's also the concrete floor, which is comparatively thick and soaks up the heat also. So it helps keep my house from overheating. I generally don't get hotter in my house than ambient outside temperature. I used to have a house that didn't have a lot of thermal mass, and I was always in the 90s in the summertime in my house. I've never seen 90 degrees in this house. Probably 83 is the hottest I've ever seen, and it was about 85 outside the day. It was 83 inside, which is kind of typical for my house. The peak temperatures in my house will be a little bit cooler than outside ambient temperature. And it's because of the thermal mass. So solar gain is bringing that sunshine into the house, and this is a computer model of my floor plan. And facing south is that door in the lower left of the house. That wall, that 1/8 exterior wall of the house, is due south. And you can see that all of the glass in my house is on the south, the southeast, the southwest, and then there's a couple of bedroom windows, one east and one west, for egress and also a little bit of solar gain. So I guess real quickly, just so you understand, if you start in the master bedroom in the upper left and then move to the right is the master bathroom, and then there's a walk-in closet just above that on the exterior wall. Then there's a closet in the Arctic entry, the front door that goes into the Arctic entry there. The next room in the corner, top right, is the master utility room. The next room down we affectionately call the mom cave. My wife does arts and crafts work in there, and it's a disaster, and you don't want to go in there. It's the mom cave. Anyway, then there is a closet off of this other bedroom, and then you're into the great room where the kitchen and dining room area are. It's all open, one open space, and the other room in the middle of the house is another bathroom. So this is 1,860 square feet. The sun heats, sort of call it our boiler. The great room gets sunshine whether the sun's out in the morning, the afternoon, the evening. It gets sun, it gets solar gain, and we collect the heat. That's where the vast majority of the thermal mass is, and it stores that heat quite well. Keeps me from overheating, and then we can go days without any other heat source, and there's so much energy stored in all of that rock work and the slab and everything. My house just perks along. Now I have to qualify too. I have folks coming to my house frequently. They're going to this green house, you know, and so we're going to have to put an extra sweater on because, you know, I'm sure he doesn't heat the place. He brags about not heating the place, so it's going to be 60 degrees. Not. I like a nice warm house. I tell people I like my beer cold and my house warm. And so we have a fully electrified home with a good refrigerator, and it's warm. My wife's probably her major complaint is that it's too warm. She likes it in the 60s. I like it 70 to 72. And through the course of the winter, I don't think this year our house ever went hotter than 72 or colder than 70. And when you think about that, a lot of thermostatically controlled homes aren't that consistent. And we heat with wood. And I don't know anyone who heats with wood unless they have a masonry heater, and most people, even with masonry heaters, don't keep that narrow of a band on temperature fluctuation. And we'll talk about that a little more later also. But so the performance level is high. I keep it warm and comfortable, and 7 winters now, the average springtime last fire that I light to heat this house with anything other than the passive solar is March 6th. And the first fire I light is somewhere middle of October. I think the earliest is October 6th, and the latest was about the October 23rd. Depends on weather and such. So now it's even later than that, because now I use some of my solar thermal systems to augment the heating on this. So when I say passive solar in that time frame, March 6 through October 10, that is strictly passive solar heating. That is none of the technology. None of the technology involved in that. That's pretty awesome when you think about it in our climate. And you're between 70 and 72 degrees, except in the summer it gets hotter than that. But in the winter, no, but summer, yes. So anyway, that's a huge energy savings. I mean, how many people here have their heater come on sometime in March? I mean, it's 20 below zero. Your heater come on at your house? Not my house. Nothing. That's the free energy. That's the sweet spot here. And it saves money in the rest of the wintertime too, because what's making that work helps you in the wintertime reduce the energy that you do need. That's why when it's 10 below zero, I light one small fire a day in my masonry heater, and I maintain that 70 to 72 degree temperature. Dan will tell you, he was working at my house, and the generator went out. It was how cold outside? 30 below zero, 3 days. We didn't have electricity to run our auxiliary heating. We had a window that was broken, a 6-foot by 16-inch window was broken, so we had a piece of visqueen flapping over that open window. We had no heat in the house for 3 days, and it was never went below 50 degrees. So, the passive solar design, which includes all those things up there in the corner, the solar gain, the thermal mass, and the efficient envelope, those are all priority one. And if you do those, you reduce your energy demand to 10% or less of what it is otherwise in a typical Fairbanks home. Then you can get into the fun technology stuff and making all these things work together. And you can do the water system. The yellow is the electricity, and the pinkish blue is the water side of this equation. And so let's start with the electricity. It's easy. So we have solar PV panels. I have a 2,000 watt solar array. I have a wind turbine. That's a 3 kW wind turbine. And those puppies generate almost all the electricity I need. When they generate too much electricity so that it's more than what I need to run the house, I have batteries that we charge up. And if the batteries are full and I still have extra electricity, which happens a lot, then I run some heating coils in the domestic hot water tank. Okay? And I store that wasted electricity as heat in my domestic hot water tank. We'll get to that a little bit more. When we don't have either the wind or the solar, the generator kicks in, back up, and charges the batteries up till they're full, and then it shuts off. All that's automatic. I don't have to touch it or do anything with it. Important thing to note if you're considering any of this stuff is you don't need the batteries if you're on the grid. This house is totally off grid. So I know every watt of energy that I use and heat and whatnot, because I am totally off grid. So that's one of the big expenses. When people ask about cost and break even and whatnot, if I didn't have to have those batteries, my PV system would cost half of what it does with the bank of batteries that I have. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. But anyway, it's a misconception a lot of people have, which is why I'm stressing it. They think if you use solar PV or solar electric panels, you got to have batteries. No, not if you're on the grid, you don't. So, because people don't like messing with batteries, and I don't either, but I'm off grid. So the water side of this now for heat. So I have 3 tanks. One of them is called the preheat tank. That's a 50-gallon tank. Then there's the domestic tank, which is the hub of my heating system. And then I have a seasonal storage tank that's buried outside my house in the ground. That's 12,000 gallons. That's the size of a tractor-trailer Conex box, just a little bigger. It's a lot of water. It was 164 degrees yesterday in that tank at my house. The whole 12,000 gallons, 164 degrees. So that's where I store heat. The heat that I'm using comes from the domestic tank, and I have the preheat tank to increase the efficiency of the whole system. So I have an array on my house that directly heats the preheat tank. Let me explain the system first, and then I'll give you a few details. I have a different solar thermal array that's not on this chart that directly heats the seasonal storage tank. That's an array on my garage. And it's not really a garage, it's really a rack to hold my solar thermal panels, actually, is what it is. I was going to build a rack, and I was spending as much to build this rack because solar thermal panels are heavy. I said, why am I wasting all this money on a rack? I could build a garage for an extra $2,000 and put the panels on the garage and have a 3-car garage. So I have a 3-car garage now. Anyway, the garage array heats the seasonal storage tank directly. Whenever we need domestic hot water, it comes out of the domestic tank for showers and all those things you use domestic hot water for. And this is really important because in this house, the energy demand of my hot water system exceeds the heating demand of my house on an annual basis. So when you get the solar design right, you're not worried about heating your house, you're worried about heating your shower, because I like hot showers too. And so that's where most of the energy goes in this system, is into my showers. That's how efficient the house is. Which is kind of nice too, because you got a ton of energy in the summertime. And I don't care about taking long showers in the summer because I got more hot water than I know what to do with all summer long. So fill up the hot tub, not the hot tub, or soaking tub, take a long shower, have at it. I'm glad to waste hot water in the summertime. When the domestic tank gets cold, the thermostat kicks on, and through flat plate heat exchangers, familiar with heat exchangers? Flat plate exchangers? Getting mostly nods. Because the seasonal storage tank is just plain old water, and it's not potable, and my domestic tank obviously is potable hot water, you can't mix those. So I transfer the heat through a heat exchanger and bring heat from the storage tank up and heat the water in the domestic hot water tank. Then I use that domestic hot water tank not only for showers and such, but I also can heat my house with it. There's a radiant floor heat system that has glycol in it. So we take heat from the domestic hot water tank and we heat the glycol in the floor system and heat the house that way. I can also heat the house directly from the outside seasonal storage tank. So that water that's currently 164 degrees in that big tank, I bring that up through an exchanger, exchange the heat to the glycol in the floor heating system, and heat the house with that stored heat. That's the primary use, really, of that system. I can draw BTUs out of that until the temperature goes down to about 96 degrees or so, and then it becomes too inefficient running the pumps to move the water to transfer the heat, to heat the house with it after that. So then I just shut that system off. That's when I start lighting fires in my masonry heater once that big seasonal tank gets drawn down to 96 degrees or so. There is standby loss in that. The coldest temperature I've ever seen in my storage tank, it sits from sometime in December, middle of December, I'll run out of stored heat and I have to start lighting fires. And so from that October 10th date, from the previous slide, from October 10 to the middle of December, I'm using that heat that I stored in that big storage tank to keep my house warm. And then sometime middle of December, I start lighting fires in the masonry heater.
Two direct questions. Is the seasonal storage under the slab, and what insulation do you have around that tank? Or do you use
the seasonal storage tank is not under the slab, it's next to the house, and it's got about 9 inches of spray foam on it, and it's totally buried. There's better ways to do this, and we can get into technology discussions later for those that want to get more techno-geeky with this stuff, because I like it. So feel free to ask questions. There's a lot better ways to do it. You can put the tank in the house. You can put it vertically. You can make it more efficient. That's why I have a preheat tank. You can accomplish a preheat tank, which I'm going to get into in just a second, by putting a tank vertically to get temperature stratification in the tank so that you have hot water and cold water in the same tank. And they won't mix if you're careful. And so with Arctic Sun, we developed designs where you can add water and take water out without mixing stuff up. And you can maintain that stratification, and that has big advantages. And so putting the tank in your house, your standby loss then is heat to the house instead of heat to the outside, which is a good thing. You're not wasting any of that. And if you put it vertically, you can make it more efficient. So big points.
What's your water source?
The water wagon. I have a tank outside for my domestic water, and I had them fill up the big 12,000 gallon tank. They gave me a heck of a deal because the truck had to just keep running all day to dump water. They brought an extra driver in just to haul water to me for the day, and he filled everything up. So the reason we got a preheat tank is because I'm trying to maximize the efficiency of the whole system, and when you're transferring heat through a heat exchanger, you need a difference in temperature, a delta T between the two temperatures. Makes sense. If the water in both tanks is the same temperature, you're not going to transfer anything. If one tank's hot and the other one's cold, now you can transfer when you run those through an exchanger. You really need to be efficient, you don't want to go between lower than a 10-degree delta T or temperature difference. 12 degrees is even better. All my thermostats are set for 12 degrees. And so when one tank gets hotter by 12 degrees than the other tank, we transfer some heat. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The reason the preheat tank's the big advantage is your domestic tank's always hot. You want hot water for a shower, so you don't want that tank to cool off. So my domestic tank's 120 degrees. So now for my solar thermal array up on the roof there, to put any heat into that domestic tank, if it was connected there, it would have to be 132 degrees before the pump would come on. That's a pretty hot thermal panel, you know, 132 degrees. Whereas, because the preheat tank is being fed by the cold water supply, every time I draw hot water, the water goes from the cold supply into the preheat tank and then into the domestic tank. So the bottom of that preheat tank is frequently quite cool, 45 degrees, 50 degrees. I've had it come on when it's dark outside because the outside air temperature in the evening is 70 degrees in the summertime. And if that tank is, if it's 70 outside, and do the math, 58 in the bottom of that tank, pump's going to come on even though the sun's not out because it can transfer heat because the outside panels are at the outside air temperature. And moving a BTU, a BTU of heat is the same value whether it's 120 to 121 or whether it's 30 to 31, you know, that 1 degree not crossing.
Not 31 to 32.
Exactly, yeah. I was careful when I said that because I knew we've got these scientific engineer types around here. But a BTU is a BTU. And so when we're capturing heat into that preheat tank, raising that temperature from that cold supply temperature, that outside tank's in the ground and it's not insulated, so the supply to the house. So the temperature in that tank is in the upper 30s or maybe 40 if we're lucky. That's the supply that's coming into the house. I don't want that supply going directly into my domestic tank. I want to temper it, and I can do it very efficiently by having that preheat tank. So by the time that outside cold water water works its way all the way through the preheat tank, it's already had the opportunity to warm up quite a bit. So now what happens because of the preheat tank? The sun comes up in the morning and it starts out slow and it raises the temperature of those outside panels to 80 degrees or so. That preheat tank, the pumps will come on and it'll start pulling some of that heat down into the house first thing in the morning. There's no way if those panels were connected directly to the domestic tank, it would still be sitting there. My panels don't hit, well, I'm pulling heat off of them, so that slows down their gain, but they won't typically hit 132 until noonish. So I wouldn't be able to pull any heat down. I wouldn't gain any energy off of them until afternoon time if I was hooked directly to the domestic tank. But because all morning long they've been working on that preheat tank, I'm capturing all that energy, and then as the sun gets higher and there's more heat coming in, we start dumping more heat. So it makes the whole process way more efficient. And we can go into a whole bunch more of that if you want, and I can get more technical on it. But that's some of the advantages of having stratification in a tank and having it plumbed properly. And it's one of the things that Arctic Sun really perfected, was having different locations in a tank to draw water off and how you put it back in so you don't stir it up. And when you're trying to heat it, you take water off the bottom where it's cold, and then you put it back in at its ambient temperature. And it's a little bit complicated, but we can talk about it later if you want. Anyway, when all else fails, I do have a propane heater, and it will kick on, and it will heat the domestic hot water tank when everything else goes cold, and then that can heat the house. And I've never done it except to see if it worked, because I always light a fire. But if I'm not home and I didn't light a fire or whatever, ultimately the propane heater would kick on and keep the domestic tank perking along, which would then keep the house warm. That's the utility room. The batteries are just on a rack. There's 32 of them, a little bit bigger than car batteries. They're maintenance free. They're a little more expensive than the ones you maintain, but I don't like maintenance on batteries, so I paid a little more money for these. That's the domestic tank on the right, and it's 120 gallons. And some of the plumbing, we call our plumbing tree that moves things around through some of the exchangers. So the inverter on the wall, the wind turbine comes in, the boxes, the black boxes up on the wall, kind of in the upper right, and the PV comes in below that through a solar charger. Isn't all that complicated. We did have to sneak the propane on-demand hot water heater and the preheat tank didn't fit in this room, so they're in the mom cave. Had to cheat a little. That's the masonry heater. There's the architect of the masonry heater, Mr. Dan Gibbons. Did a great job on it, yes. I really like it. It's kind of sweet. It's a little more than your typical heater. It has a pizza bake oven in it also. I got some more pictures. That's from the front on it. You can see the rocks underneath the kitchen counter on the right there, a lot more rock work, and all of that just being thermal mass. That's the kitchen. I won't talk about too many interior design things because this is an energy efficiency and not an architectural design, but I spent a lot of time trying to have a natural appeal and a natural flow to the interior design of the house, and from a variety of different ways. The kids love my house. You can see the river in, you can't see it well because the lights are on, but there's a river stained in the floor. All that was really cheap to do. It's just plain old concrete, nothing special, and stained after the slab was poured. And so I have a river that comes in my front door and goes through the house and out the back door. And it's kind of the dividing line between the dining room area and the living room area in the house, just to create a visual separation, but not a rigid line. I don't like square. I just got to tell you, I drove the contractor who built my house nuts. I'm German, so I can say this, it's okay. He's really German. And everything is rigid, it's got to be plumb, square, flat across town. Yeah, Dan knows. And I was like, there were things that just tipped him over the edge because my windows, they're not the same height. don't think I have a picture to quite illustrate that, but the dining room window comes down to dining room table height. And the living room window, because you sit down low and you want to see out, it goes down lower. And there's one of each on each side of that door. And the door height is a little lower because I wanted the windows to go all the way to the ceiling. It drove poor Torsten nuts. It's like, they don't match, you know, and they're all on the same wall, that south wall. And it was like, yeah, okay, they don't match. But in nature, lots of things don't match. Things usually aren't square. They're usually rounded off and such. And so my house is not square, and things are plumb that need to be plumb. But the cabinets aren't the same height at the top. The kitchen counter is just a free-form shape. Torsten said, where do I put this? I mean, what do I measure off of to place this on the floor? Where do I construct this? How do I measure this? I said, I'll draw it on the floor for you. Relax, it's okay. So it's challenging dealing with some contractors that are doing things that may be new to them. Like?
It's a natural wood of local birch.
That's local birch. Cabinets are local birch. Yeah. So we had fun with a lot of things. My backsplash, if you don't recognize Deborah and Hess from the Alaska range, the backsplash in my house, it goes on the other side of the stove. Mount Hayes and Moffett are on the other side of the range, the stovetop range, as you go across. Little things that we did to take away those straight lines and the straight edges that you get in a house. With some things you can't avoid, like countertops are preferred to be flat and straight, you know. I get that. But the backsplash doesn't have to match, and it breaks up that rigid line that's there a little bit. So we tried. It's Corian. Challenging decision. All these decisions you get to make when you build a house. What do you use? What do you use for countertops? You know? And I agonized over my countertops. For a month, I agonized over the countertops because there's not a good answer. There's high maintenance things like concrete, which, you know, there's trade-offs with whatever you pick. And there's immediate environmental impact, and then there's long-term environmental impact from the choices that you make. And Corian is indestructible, lasts 50 years, it's maintenance-free, and if you scratch the heck out of it, you can just sand the surface and it's good as new again, you know. And so I'm not going to have to replace these countertops for a long, long, long time. And so the long-term environmental, because it takes a lot of nasty chemicals to make Corian countertops, excuse me, so they're not real green from that perspective. So there's trade-offs with whatever you do. Wood, high maintenance, and there can be health issues with bacteria and concrete and wood and yada yada, and tough decisions. As green as it gets, I don't know. Can't say for sure. But the drawer pulls are rocks that my wife and I collect rocks. By the way, all the rocks that Dan set in our house, my wife and I collected. They're from all over the state of Alaska, a few from the Yukon Territory. We like collecting rocks, and that's the biggest argument my wife and I have is, how many rocks will a canoe hold and still float? She has a different opinion than me. I'm a little more safety conscious. She's a little more rock conscious. And so we discuss that on canoe trips. But yeah. So we make things out of the rocks that we have, besides have Dan make masonry heaters. We decorate the house with them. There's the river coming down the hallway and an island in our hallway. With some rocks that were placed in the concrete while we were building the house. That was a challenge, by the way. You know where in the design where those rocks go, but when there's nothing but an octagon-shaped concrete slab and no landmarks on it, it's 50 feet of concrete. Where do those rocks go? Because you got to stick them in while the concrete's still soft. It was a challenge. They were laughing at me with my string lines trying to locate and triangulate where those rocks go. That's the master bath. Simplicity of design. Back to the design. If you spend time on the design and get it right, the masonry heater firebox is right in the middle of the soaking tub in that rock wall. And so in the wintertime, when the masonry heater's heating the house, we can fill that tub with hot water and it stays hot indefinitely. With no pumps, no moving parts, nothing special. It's just because the tub is placed next to the heater. And more.
Is that the back wall of the heater?
That's the back wall of the heater. The firebox is right there. That's the guest bath, some more rock drawer pulls, and towel racks made out of junk pieces of birch from my firewood pile. Peel the bark off, put a little finish on them, hang a towel on it. Makes it a little more natural looking. Lots more rocks, thermal mass, the interior great room, part of the kitchen. That's how we located the kitchen island, by the way. There are 2 straight lines there. The face of the kitchen sink is a straight line, and the face of the kitchen counter next to the refrigerator is a straight line. And so that's how we locate the island. You actually have 2 parallel surfaces to measure off of. So, the total annual energy demand for 2 bedrooms, 1,860 square feet, and 3 people living there, and I can speak from experience, teenage boys take long showers and use a lot of hot water in the wintertime, and there's high electric demands with computers that have 7 fans, because I don't even know how many giga capacity his computer is, but anyhow, I do have a now in college at UAF son. We use 1.5 cords of firewood. This is average to high for us in a year. Last year we barely used a cord of firewood. Now that 1 to 1.5 cords of firewood was our space heat that we needed for the winter, and a good chunk of our domestic hot water, because there is that water line in the masonry heater. So whenever I light a fire to heat the house, I'm heating domestic hot water at the same time. Doesn't cover 100% of my domestic hot water, because this is kind of a new gig. It was Dan's first with water lines and masonry heaters. You hadn't done one before that, had you? Yeah, you know you did one, I guess. We were kind of, okay, how much pipe do you need in the firebox to create enough hot water that you're not drawing too much of the heat from the house so that you're overheating your domestic hot water? There's a balance there. So you got to figure out your domestic hot water load, how much are you going to use, and then what's the demand from the house. And it's not hard science. This isn't something you can just pull your calculator out and come up with this. So you kind of got to guess, and it takes a little more experience. And we guessed a little light on the amount of pipe that's in the firebox. And so heaters that we did after this with Arctic Sun and Rena Construction Company, we put literally at Torsten's house, there's 6 times the length of pipe in his firebox that I have in mine, but he had a higher, that would have been too much for my house, but he has 2 girls, a wife and himself, so he has a higher demand for hot water, and it worked out okay in his firebox. So it's kind of it's a bit of an art to figuring that out. Anyway, so I probably heat in the wintertime 25% to 30% of my hot water is covered by the masonry heater, and the rest is by propane. 18 gallons of diesel fuel takes care of my generator. It runs anywhere from 6 to, I think the worst winter, it ran 10 times. College students throw big parties at Christmas time, and there's not much sun for your solar panels, and there's high electric loads at Christmas time. So generator runs the end of December and early January, but typically between the wind turbine and the solar panels, I'm pretty well covered. One winter it only ran 5 times all year, and I think 10 times was the worst. So it takes about 18 gallons of diesel fuel to accomplish that. And then propane that we use for cooking, the stove and ovens propane, the refrigerator's propane, and then the backup for domestic hot water when all else fails is propane. And I go through about 160 gallons annually. So I'm off grid. That's the entire energy demand for my house.
Plus solar and wind, are they fractional portions, or are they, it's just that they're not, you've already pre-capital bought them? But solar and wind are also energy inputs.
Well, solar and wind are generating my electricity,
Right.
and the vast majority of it. I have a pretty good spot for wind, which is not typical for Fairbanks. I'm not like a big, huge wind advocate. It can be very, very good, and it's great at my house. And I probably get real close to half of the energy that I use off of my wind turbine. Well, a lot of it ends up being wasted because this time of year, all that electric that's coming off the wind turbine, I'm getting it from solar too, and I don't need it. So my domestic hot water heater coils are heating domestic hot water. And so what happens is, I should have mentioned this, so when tanks get too hot, because that certainly can happen, as soon as one tank in the system exceeds the temperature of the next downstream tank, a pump kicks on and we equalize the temperature. So the preheat tank will roll heat down to the domestic tank, and the domestic tank rolls heat down to the outside storage tank whenever there's extra heat in the equation. And that happens a lot, that this happens. So the sun comes up in the morning and the domestic tank is hot, the preheat tank is cool. The preheat tank will do this, and then as it gets to here, we do this with those two tanks. And then this tank will tip over and roll heat out to the storage tank. And it gets a little dicey when the outside storage tank is 164 degrees like it was this morning, because that means this tank needs to be 176 before it has that delta T to dump heat out there. And that means that this tank needs to be 188 before it'll roll. And so we start approaching this time of year. I'll get to your question. I was real nervous about this because the first year I had this stuff, particularly the big panels for the outside tank, I thought, oh my God, it's April and my tank was up to 160 degrees already in April. And I was like, I'm going to be boiling stuff here shortly. What am I going to do? Luckily, my systems are designed that I can shut the panels, the thermal panels off, and they will drain. They're drain back systems, so that I can just turn them off and the fluid drains out, because you don't want to boil the glycol in your panels. That's not a good thing to do. And so I do have a stop gap, but I figured, man, I over-designed this system something fierce, because I'm going to be shutting these puppies off by the 1st of May, you know, and this is not a good thing. Well, what happens is, as the temperature, we talked about efficiency earlier and needing that preheat tank to be cold so you could pull power down. Well, once the whole system is racked up to 160 degrees, now it takes some real hot thermal panels to add anything to that. So the whole system just gets inefficient, because there aren't many hours in a day that those thermal panels can get to 188 degrees, 200 degrees. If the preheat tank is now up to 188, because that's the way it tears off, now we need 200 on the thermal panels to put any heat into it. There aren't a lot of days or a lot of hours in a day that you hit those levels with flat plate collectors. So my whole system becomes very inefficient, and we still are using domestic hot water, so there's a load on it every day for the domestic. So we're pulling enough off that what happens is, in the springtime, the storage temperatures race up to 155 to 160-ish, and then I do this the rest of the summer. And it goes from 160 to 166, 167 maybe. That's the hottest I've ever seen the storage tanks, 167. And then it just keeps doing that all summer long. It hits this equilibrium because the efficiency of the overall system is detuned. And then it maintains that pretty well into the fall. I can still keep pretty hot temperatures as it ratchets down and it gets into 140 degrees in that storage tank. I can pull in more energy now because the system's more efficient. Then I'm gaining efficiency as it cools off. And so that helps in the shoulder seasons to make it all work. You had a question?
Have you ever had any damage to your solar panels with the wind?
I have never had any damage to my solar panels, not a thing. The whole system's worked flawlessly for 7 years. It's pretty straightforward, you know. I mean, it's copper pipes in a black box. Ron?
What's the collector area for your seasonal storage for the thermal panels?
I have 8 4x10s hooked directly to the seasonal tank, and I have 4 4x10s hooked to the domestic system that are on the house. Efficiency doesn't mean you need to be Spartan. My house is comfortable, if you haven't gotten that idea. Extreme efficiency actually creates extreme comfort, and it's something I didn't think about ahead of time, but I tell you, regularly, the wife and I sit in the living room and go, oh my God, this house is just so comfortable, 70 to 72, 70 to 72. No ceiling fan. Dan kind of knows me. I get a little anal sometimes about things. I know you're surprised to hear that, but I have an infrared thermometer, and I used to go around and take temperatures of different rocks in my house. Take temperature in the ceiling, you point the thermometer up there, check the floor. 2 degrees difference between the ceiling and the floor in my house. 2 degrees, no ceiling fan, 14-foot ceiling. But when your shell is so efficient and you're losing heat so slowly out of it, it equalizes inside that chamber because it has a long, long time to sit there. And you got all these river rocks throwing out radiant energy around your house, and a rock throws out the energy to the tangent of the surface. So when you have a curved surface, just like the sun, the radiant energy goes out like this, right? It also goes out this way and this way because they're round all the way around. So all those round river rocks are way better than bricks, which throw out a straight wall of heat when they're radiating heat. But all those rocks on the masonry heater are throwing out heat in every single direction around my house. All that sunshine is happening. So the whole place, equal temperature. Temperature from the living room by the masonry heater out to the Arctic entry at the end of the hall with the cold air that might leak through the entry. The Arctic entry I haven't seen below 68 degrees. Because the whole house is just that efficient, and it equalizes within there with all that thermal mass. Sustainable is kind to the environment and your wallet. Almost everything in this house is either has paid for itself already or it will very, very soon as far as economic payback. The part that doesn't work so well, and I got to be honest with you, the big thermal storage tank cost a heck of a lot of money. 9 inches of foam on a tank that size, I think the bill was $13,000. There's cheaper ways to do it now. A lot of this stuff could be done cheaper today than when this was built in 2009. Lots of design improvements, ways to do it cheaper. But we were in a hurry. We started construction October 1st. Started snowing on October 14th. And so we had a challenge on our hands, yeah. Not an ideal time to start building a house. I knew better. I used to be a general contractor. But I wanted to build my house, and we moved in January. So we were pretty fast and efficient under the conditions that we were working in. But this stuff does pay for itself. It does have an economic value to it, even more so now because the prices on solar have come down significantly since 2009. Part of this, and the reason this is difficult for people to adopt, is that every house and every house site is unique. It all has different potentials and different options. You need sunshine. You don't have to be on top of a hill, but you do need solar gain to gain energy from the sun. If you're on the north side of a hill in Fairbanks, not so good. Okay? So you got a different problem on your hands. It's all site specific. So it isn't like you can go to Walmart and buy a widget off the shelf. You can't just buy a specific design because this house would perform terribly in the deserts in Arizona. You know, works pretty good here in Fairbanks, though. So again, it's site specific. It's the same variability we have with how we get dressed. It's your lifestyle, you know. All those things have to go into consideration. And any home strikes a balance in all of these systems. And it's key to try to find that balance and what works for you in finding that balance.
I just had a question. You're talking about the tank, and where did you get a 12,000-gallon tank? That's huge.
Well, the feds are getting uppity about buried tanks. So a lot of people, like up on the North Slope, are pulling out storage tanks because of the federal regulations. And so you can find some used ones. So there was a real scientific process that we engaged in to determine I needed a 12,000-gallon tank. It was real cheap. And we said, that's just what we need. Torsten and I were in the middle of this long debate. We'd been at it for about 3 months, calculating the perfect tank. you know, and how many gallons did we need? Because we're looking at load and we're looking at gain and we're running all these numbers and we're being real scientific. And we were thinking somewhere between 10 and 20,000, you know, we knew is what we were targeting. But where was the sweet spot in there? And the sweet spot was, I just found a tank we can get for damn near nothing. It's 12,000 gallons. That's just what we needed. But then we had to insulate it, and it was round, and that was problematic, you know. And we needed to do it in a hurry. That was the real problematic part. So we paid 13 grand to spray foam it. I'd do it differently now. But that's about the only part that didn't really pencil out from an economic perspective. And part of it's because the house is so dang efficient that all that tank really does for me is balance from October 10 to December 10. 2 months worth of heat is stored in that tank over the course of the summer. That's really all I use it for. The rest of the system would accomplish all that it's doing on its own. There might be a tiny little bit of heat required if we had, say, 2 weeks of rain and no sun in the summertime. You know, there could be a little bit of a load in there. But essentially, all that huge tank and all of that equipment, all it really does is bridge October 10 to December 10, which we were trying to see how close can we come to not needing any fossil fuel. You know, that was sort of a target that we wanted to see how close we can get to that. And you need storage, big storage, to accomplish it. And so that's why we did it. I'm glad I did it, and I would do it again. Well, I'd do it a little differently, and I would do it again just from the green perspective to see what we could do. It was kind of a challenge and it was fun, but there isn't a good payback on it. That's the bottom line. You know, I don't need that much heat. She was first with a question. Mary Ann?
You mentioned that it was your fire insurance.
Well, it was helpful for fire insurance, yeah, because I'm the last house in my fire service area, and the state doesn't respond real well out there if there's like wildfires and such, which we've had in my neighborhood. And so I do have 12,000 gallons of water, and I do have an electric pump, and I just stick it into the tank, and I have a fire hose and a water supply because I have electricity, you know, so I can self-defend if need be. So that is an advantage of my tank. You have a question?
Any guess or estimate of how many BTUs out of that storage, that big storage system, compared to just what you would get by burning another cord of wood in a basement heater? I mean, can you translate
That's
that?
exactly it. I'd probably need, I've never run the specific numbers on it, and that could be done because we know the BTUs in the water. And it's pretty hot at that time. You're probably looking at less than a cord for sure. In outside ambient temperatures that time of year, I would wag a guess in the neighborhood of 2/3 of a cord maybe. So that entire financial investment is saving me 2/3 of a cord of wood, ballpark guess, a year. And it's a lot of money, obviously, for that return, and which is why I'm saying I wouldn't necessarily encourage that part of the design. However, that's the way I did it too, and there are better ways to do it. So the cost, it could be accomplished for much less money and be more efficient with these new designs. So you could get a better return from your tank, and the system would cost less with what we learned. This house was the first in a new generation of net zero-ish homes, and Torsten has gone on to build a number since then, and every one, we're probably 4th or 5th generation in technology now in doing this sort of thing, and it gets better every time, and the cost is coming down every time. Ron?
I was just redoing that number. I agree with you with the cords of wood, but 100,000 pounds of water in the tank, it drops by 70 degrees Fahrenheit roughly to get all the heat out. You just multiply 70 by 100,000, you get about 7 million BTUs, which is close to what I think you were saying.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Although you sort of said this, it sounds like you overheat a little bit in the summer. And I just wonder, you know, the president's house has that overhead shading device that's kind of passive. Have you ever thought about just putting it's a fairly innocuous kind of design. It's You know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I have that on the southwest window of my house. I have an awning that I put up seasonally that goes straight out over that window, and it doesn't block the view at all because I like my view, but it sticks straight out horizontally about 4 feet, and it reduces the solar gain on that big southwest facing window. And so, you know, I'm not really overheating so much from the solar gain because my eaves are large too. So in the spring is really the worst time, as when the sun's lower, that's when the solar gain is really toasting me. It's the beginning of March that my house is the hottest. Then the sun starts getting higher and the eaves that stick out reduce that solar gain. Well, it's just the ambient air temperature because I don't have any cooling system at all. And so if it's 85 outside and it's...
You don't have openable windows?
Yeah, but if it's 85 outside, it's going to be 85 inside.
At least you can blow the air through.
Well, but I'm cooler than outside. So we open the windows in the morning and we open the windows at night and we close them during the day when it's hotter outside than it is inside to try to keep it cooler. So I would be glad to answer questions. We can keep going. Sunset Roost, thank you. That's McKinley and 4-acre again. We are at our limit, actually, over it, but I'm glad to chat and answer questions. And if you need to go, have a good evening. It's been a pleasure. And you had a question?
In the house, it looks like most of the thermal mass is in the great room. So how do you transfer the heat to the other rooms? Is that through the radiant heating? Let's say into the bedrooms and so on?
No, because the house is so the question is moving heat around in the house. I don't have to move the heat around in the house because it's so well insulated and it leaks out so slowly, it just equalizes within the house, particularly because the masonry heater is essentially dead center in the house. And it radiates off the back wall into the master bathroom, which is more also right in the center of the house. Again, that was part of intentional design. I don't like getting out of the shower into a cold bathroom. These people who have bathrooms in the corner of their house with windows and such that are one of the colder rooms in their house, I don't get that design at all. So my master bath is right behind the masonry heater, and that's the warmest room in my house by a long shot. And so it'll actually stay 74-ish in that master bath because of the radiant heat off the back of the heater. And so it's no moving parts. That's the only heat I'm moving sort of deliberately into that space because it's just right there. But it equalizes through the rest of the house very well because of the envelope. Yes?
Do you always bring fresh air in, like HRV?
Yes, I have an air exchanger, an HRV unit. You have to with a house that's that tight. And they're very efficient. And we have operable windows too, but they're not as efficient to use in the wintertime.
And besides infrared view, are you instrumented in a number of things that helps you identify things and then be able to visualize what works and what doesn't?
I monitor some things. We've got temperature sensors all around, all sorts of different things that we monitor informally. I have a bunch of other fun things. We're experimenting with a couple of shutters. I have a blown-in shutter that's the kids who come and visit, they really like. I flip a switch and a blower turns on and it blows styrofoam beads into a 4-inch cavity outside our dining room window. And it looks like it's snowing out as the beads come in. And it fills that 4-inch cavity with styrofoam beads. And improves, obviously, the R value of that big window and makes it very comfortable sitting at the dining room table right against that window. So that's kind of a fun thing. We have a sliding door type shutter on our master bedroom. That's my wife's favorite tool. She uses it more in the summertime than the winter because she can make the bedroom dark by sliding the shutter closed. It's just an electric switch on the wall, and you flip the switch up and it closes, you flip the switch down and it opens, and it does add significant R value. And it was a bit of an experiment also. Arctic Sun, we installed those to see how much efficiency we could gain with them because windows are so inefficient for R value. And so I don't have any pictures of those right now, but they're fun little things. And the kids love watching it snow. Ron?
I wonder if this is the only masonry heater Dan has installed where he didn't have to get the rocks.
I don't know. I did. He was impressed. We were surprised with how many rocks it took because I had a stash of rocks and we had fun with that. But I did end up having enough ultimately for the project, but I had divided them into the A rocks that we wanted to use, the high quality rocks that looked really cool, and the B pile of rocks that, well, if we have to get into that pile, they're a little plainer and whatever. We needed all of both piles of rocks before the project was done.
We had rocks that froze in and rain climbed, 30 below, he's out. Then we'd have to fall them out for a day before we could use them.
We had all the A rocks in a tent. I planned ahead, right? So I said, Dan, how many rocks do we need? And he said, I don't know, a lot. So I filled up this 16 by 20 tent, one of those portable garage type things, 16 by 20, 3 tiers deep of rock in this tent. Dan says, that looks probably all right. We'll see how it goes. So all the rest of the rocks, I just, they just threw them outside on the tundra and the moss. Well, then in January, when we ran out of rocks in the tent and I had to retrieve the ones that were frozen in the moss, he was laughing at me. I had an 8-foot crowbar underneath the rocks and I'm bouncing on it trying to break them loose.
Actually, I'm pretty impressed with the hell of the worker.
I promised I'd provide the rocks to him in the living room so that when he calculated the price of this, I said, I'll bring the rocks, I'll put them in the living room the day ahead of time, I'll keep you supplied so you have rocks to choose from. And it was a chore because he's pretty fast, and I was having trouble keeping up when I was breaking them loose from the ground.
Like you, I live up in the relative banana belt there in the wintertime, not quite as far out probably, but I've often wondered if my efficiency is gained through living in a slightly warmer place and having some good passive solar and all that. Isn't offset by the gas I put into my car and the fuel that goes into the water wagon truck. Have you ever figured into living in your house the expenses of the transportation?
Well, I didn't build the house till I was retired. Yeah, I'm retired, right? Okay. And I didn't think I'd be commuting as much. But when I found out that I was mayor, I went and bought a 40-plus mile per gallon efficient car so that I wouldn't burn as much as what I do in my truck because of that. And that is definitely a concern. You burn a lot more gas when you're living out there, and it is a bit of an offset to the efficiency. Marianne?
Is the bedroom ever too hot to sleep in? The master bedroom?
Depends on your definition. For me, no. For Billy, my wife, yes. She does complain about it, but because this is a concern, well, I can't really do anything about it. So if you have thermostat wars like some couples do, where the wife typically it's the wife pushes the thermostat up, and then the husband goes over and pushes the thermostat down, not to be sexist. Our house is the opposite. You don't want to live in this kind of a house because you can't adjust the temperature in this house quickly because all that thermal mass takes days. That's why it stays between 70 and 72 degrees. It's incredibly consistent. And to get any fluctuation in that takes a major, major effort. And so even in the summertime, we stay a little bit too warm because the house won't cool off. Even with the windows open, there's just so much heat in all that rock. If we've had an 85-degree outside day and the temperature in the house typically in the 77 range, with the windows open the next morning, it'll only have dropped to 75, 74 degrees, which is too warm for Billy, and I can't do anything about it. Windows are open. Any other questions? Thank you so much. I appreciate it.